Okay, I'm going to do a talk on ethics and research ethics. The sections I'll go through, first of all, introduce ethics and some definitions of core terms, and then some ethical theories. Then look more specifically at the applied practice of ethics as it features in research, and then look at the dark side of research. In terms of definitions, these terms overlap, but ethics is often thought of as the study of morality. It can be a philosophical subject, but it's also an applied subject, that is a real-world subject. Morals are standards that you use to judge right and wrong. Values tend to be for a person or an organization, how they think they should conduct life. Key to ethics is this idea that it's a decision-making process. So this goes right back to Aristotle a couple of thousand years ago. To sensibly assign praise or blame, we infer that someone has exercised choice. So you can't act ethically without making some kind of decision, or unethically without it being the result of some kind of decision or choice. The main theories I'm going to talk through: utilitarianism, duty, and the ethics of care, and then virtue ethics. On the left there you've got John Stuart Mill. On the right you've got Jeremy Bentham. These were the founding theorists associated with utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, sometimes it's translated as maximizing happiness, but happiness is a very simplistic term. Utility, it's best seen of really in the context of the fair state. So utility is about maximizing utility. Utilitarianism is about maximizing utility, not just simply happiness. The advantages, it seems quite simple and transparent because you're only looking at one thing. It does seem to describe some aspects of life and business in the sense that we make trade-offs and choices between options based on which we think will be the best. And it has this appearance of rationality. The downsides are quite well known, and most of them center around the problems of measuring or defining utility. It's also difficult to predict whether a choice will lead to the greatest benefit. So utilitarianism is consequentialist. It's depending on outcomes. It can be in tension with rights. Individual rights can sometimes frustrate the wish for a group collective outcome or benefits, and it can also be in tension with ideas of justice or sharing. A link to a case there is of Pinto. They basically calculated the costs of repairing a fault in the car, which would, under certain circumstances from a rear collision, lead to a fire. And they worked out how much it would cost for the number of people who would die from that, 180 times 200,000. The number of people who'd be seriously injured, 180 times 67,000. And then the number of people who'd suffer injuries that were minor, 2,100 times 700. And then figured out that the cost of the lawsuits and being prosecuted was around $49 million, whereas to fix this on all of 12.5 million vehicles would cost $11 or 137 million. So it's not exactly utilitarianism, but you can see there's an idea of a trade-off between the value of or cost of making these repairs versus how much it would cost you in court. It's a good case for illustrating that you can't make these trade-offs. You can't measure things like welfare, human life, and so on always. This guy is Immanuel Kant, and he's most associated with the ethics of duty, or it's sometimes called Kantianism, which is a particular form of this ethics of duty. He has two principles. They're basically like the golden rule of how you treat others. First of all, he says act in such a way that it's universalizable. So you imagine you're living in a place where everybody does the same thing faced with the same situation, and also in a reflexive fashion. So how would you feel if it were done to you? And the second aspect to his what's called a categorical imperative, the second aspect to this is people are never simply means, but they're ends in themselves. So you don't use people because people are ends in themselves. Advantages of this, there's a kind of intuitive sense to it. It's similar to a lot of principles in the world's major religions about loving your neighbour and so on. It seems rational, it seems a basis for making decisions, and it's consistent with not just with religious ideals but most of the major ethical frameworks. On the downsides, sometimes you might have conflicting rights, so people can suffer, let's say, pollution, but the costs of that are, if we don't have some element of pollution, we don't have industry on a large enough scale. So there can be impossible kind of trade-offs in Kantianism. Which principles do you follow? Can there be some seemingly unethical practices that are in actual fact ethical? A case sometimes used to illustrate it is of Caltex, who operated in South Africa during the era of apartheid, which was a state-enforced discrimination on a number of levels according to race and ethnicity. Caltex were making the argument that they were providing a beacon of fairness because they didn't discriminate amongst workers who were at their plant in South Africa based on race and ethnicity. Other people argued that Caltex, by operating in that regime, were lending an air of legitimacy to the apartheid government. So Archbishop Tutu said famously about this situation that he didn't want people to polish his chains, he wanted to have them taken away. Both of these, taking them together, utilitarianism and Kantianism, they're quite impersonal. They are fairly abstract and imply a kind of calculating. They're very kind of rational. They ignore the emotions because they're both about principles. Utilitarianism is about the consequences. Kantianism or duty-based ethics are about the processes. And they both downgrade intuition, so there should be the same rational calculative process in all situations. Neither of them recognizes a community, so you're supposed to treat, like the love thy neighbour parable in the New Testament, you're supposed to treat a complete stranger as your friend, and under Kantian and utilitarian ethics you treat complete strangers the same as you would your neighbour or even a member of your own family. So in that way they're quite unrealistic. They don't tend to allow for conflicting values. They both suggest that there is a kind of principle that you can follow in every situation. Although, having said that, one thing that's overlooked by critics of utilitarianism often is that utilitarianism was not proposed as a solution to every ethical problem, but as a principle of last resort. So Mill would have been quite happy with Kantian principles applying to some ethical decisions. A third, a more contemporary perspective is ethics of care, and the reason for introducing it straight after these two is that it's a challenge to some of these ideas of impartiality, abstractness, calculating, and so on. And the person most associated with that with Carol Gilligan, her book In a Different Voice. And this was partly a feminist critique because it was suggesting that these calculating, rational systems of Mill and of Kant were quite masculine ways of looking at ethical problems. And what's interesting about the care perspective is that you don't just assume there are these general principles that apply to everybody. You acknowledge that people are in webs of relationships, so you are caring and you're responsible, and part of being a person is about the networks that you are connected to, so you respond to the particular, to the person. So it's not really just love thy neighbour with the neighbour being anybody. There's a recognition that you do care for people according to how close you are to them, so there's a localness to it. An example of where that may have been a way to describe a business decision at the Malden factory fire. It burned down, Malden, a town in the States, and because the owner felt a strong connection to that community, rather than relocating, which would have only cost $100 million, he decided to rebuild the factory within that community. advantages of the care system, it's kind of more realistic in a way. We do tend to treat people we know differently. And it also pays attention to emotions, which are an important part of decision making. If we go back to the idea of ethics as a decision process, it can be associated with favoritism or bigotry. Can be hard to resolve conflicts between different people, and you might have burnout. So how big is your network? If you're interested in the fair trade movement, for instance, then your network of care extends across the world. The fourth major tradition, this is from the film 300, is virtue ethics, and that's an illustration of the kind of Spartan way of life in that film. Is a particular virtue, a particular way of living. So the Spartans had some interesting values that they lived by. Given a shield, come back with your shield or on it. In other words, don't lose your shield. And if you don't come back alive without your shield, but you could be carried home dead on it. There were two types of people who got named graves in Spartan civilization. One was those who died in battle, which was kind of the most glorious way for Spartans to die, and the other was women who died in childbirth, because that was seen as a comparable service to the state. The central questions in virtue ethics are quite simple, really. They're what makes a person good, what is the good life, and it's a way of looking at ethics through the development of character or stories. And an important aspect of virtues is this linkage to a social context. So the virtues in Sparta were very different from the virtues in Athens, say. And one thing that's emphasized in it is practical wisdom. So it's something, virtues are practiced, they're something that you learn over time. You become hopefully better at exercising, and you become better at making wiser decisions, which is quite different from the Kantian and the utilitarian perspectives, because they're kind of cross-sectional in the sense that a decision is about what happens at a particular time, and it doesn't really take into account the development, the moral sophistication of the agent taking that decision. One way in which you can look at it is through the opposite of virtue, which is vice, what things have done badly. So that's how people in common language talk about collapses, like Enron, Anderson, WorldCom, more recently Carillion. Its advantages are it's very accessible, there's a rich tradition, it ties to the emotions, and it fits well with the other theories. So you can have Kantian elements. The pursuit of Kantian principles can be a virtue. Similarly, the pursuit of utility can be a virtue, and it can be associated with a network of care in terms of the links to communities. A disadvantage is a problem listing virtues. So there's been, particularly within the Catholic tradition, there's been endless amounts written about what the virtues should be, for whom, what order, which take precedent, are there any crowning or cardinal virtues. And a related issue is they don't really provide rules for action, because in virtue ethics you're continually attending to the complexities of a situation, a problem. Whereas the Kantian and utilitarian perspectives generally treat ethical situations as, the same. They're not really allowing for the possibility that principles might not apply in very complex and contested settings. In terms of applying this a bit more to the ethics of research, so I'll talk a bit about principles of research ethics, then your relationships with participants, covert research, reflexivity, and servants of power as the kind of dark side element. So similarly to the first part of the talk, ethics can be defined as a set of moral principles. The American Sociological Association has those kinds of ethical principles: competence, integrity, responsibility, respect for rights. So respect for rights and dignity and so on, those are Kantian duty type ideals. Social responsibility is almost more like a kind of utilitarian idea. The British Sociological Association has similar statements, and again, professional integrity and relations and responsibilities towards research participants are the key elements there. In terms of professional integrity, one of the things you need to do is maintain the integrity of your discipline. So when you're carrying out research, you're in a sense representing other people in that discipline, and for that reason there's this idea of spoiling the field. For a lot of people, if you're carrying out research, you'll be the only representative of the academic community that they come across, and so their perceptions of what academic research involve may be dependent almost exclusively on your conduct. So you don't want to spoil the field, you don't want to make people feel uncomfortable or not informed or whatever, because it jeopardizes the discipline as a whole. There are also national laws and administrative regulations that you have to observe. Recognizing the boundaries of competence, particularly if you're inexperienced, you may not be as willing or able to do this, to recognize when let's say an interview is going into territory that you're not comfortable with discussing, or you can't respond to what an interviewee is saying and so on. You need to recognize the boundaries of competence. And there's a tendency, partly because, particularly again with interviews, you're in a position of power. There's a tendency to kind of assume that your competence is all encompassing if you're not careful. Research needs to be something that is worthwhile, and the techniques that you pursue need to be appropriate. And you need to be clear about, this is about being reflexive on your practice. You need to be clear about the limits of your detachment from and involvement in the areas of your study. So if I can give an example, I was doing an interview once where somebody said that they wanted to quit, and then started telling me this kind of general, quite a horrible story about why they wanted to quit. And that involves reacting and how you respond to that. You've got on the human level, you want to listen and you want to be supportive and empathetic, but as a researcher you also need to be careful about limits. So one thing in that situation would be to make sure that the person knew that you weren't going to reuse any of those comments, you weren't going to attribute to them and so on, and also to try and remain with some level of detachment, to try and be able to see multiple perspectives, not just their perspective. If it occurs in relations with the media, there can be a temptation to try and get a headline, and the way that the media processes research is quite problematic often, because they're a shorter time cycle and a shorter attention span and so on. So you need to be careful thinking about those kinds of things. At the same time, you have a responsibility to publish. You don't just publish for career reasons, you publish to enhance our understanding, and it's also a way of repaying the usually altruism and kindness of people who've participated in your research by showing that what they have to say is worthwhile, that that it wants a bigger audience. In terms of responsibilities towards participants, I've talked a little bit about personal and ethical moral relationships. Just because you're interviewing doesn't mean you can override other people's rights. The interview is a position of power, so you have to be careful about how you exercise that power. You've got responsibility for how your data is used, so there's the dissemination of findings in the media and so on that I've mentioned before. In terms of relationships with participants, you need to think about their well-being and their rights. So this is very much a kind of Kantian idea that people should not be harmed in any way, and how you define harm is quite broad usually. Is the importance of trust and integrity. There are disparities of power and status in the research relationship, even if you are a novice student doing even let's say an undergraduate dissertation, and you get somehow an interview with a chief executive. The very format of the interview and the fact that you're in the place where you're entitled to ask questions, you're expected to ask questions and they're expected to answer, sets up a kind of imbalance of power and status. And there can be similar imbalances when you're collecting survey data. You might be using categories that you're forcing people to choose from. So there are ethical issues about whether you ask someone to self-categorize their gender or their ethnicity. These can be hugely problematic, even what might seem like simple survey questions. You need to be open about the fact that you're collecting data. So covert research is not something that's usually endorsed. It certainly shouldn't be something that someone inexperienced does, and it would need proper scrutiny by an ethics committee. But generally you need to be very open. So as well as the do no harm, there's the informed consent. You need to explain the methods you're using and how it's being collected. That can be problematic, incidentally, if you're doing observational research, because people can wander in and out of the setting and they may not necessarily know that they're being observed at the time. So you need to be careful in your practices. You need to look after how the data is used and how it would be used in future. So if you give commitments at a certain time about how the data will be used, you need to honour those commitments. And of course you need to maintain anonymity, confidentiality and things like that. In terms of copyright law, there may be things that apply if you're doing audio or video recordings. You don't want to be breaching copyright. Informed consent I've mentioned as the kind of bedrock of research ethics. It needs to be given freely, and people need to have the right to refuse or withdraw. So at the start of any conversation, you would need to make it clear, any initial conversation, that they could withdraw at any time, ask to speak off the record, ask to afterwards, if they felt uncomfortable about something that they said, they would have the opportunity to clarify or restate. If something's particularly sensitive, you might want to share with them how you're going to use a particular quote before you do so, and you need to take care over how you represent the data. It's a process. It's not just something that happens at the beginning or once you get research committee approval or sign off. It's something that happens throughout the course of research. There are other questions about the extent to which you have access to data or to transcripts. I mentioned about consultation prior to publication. That can be something that an organisation in particular is alert to or awake to. Some organisations are extremely open about it. Others are much more concerned about what will happen with the data. One thing you can do, as well as anonymising participants and their details so that quotes can't be attributed back to them, you can also anonymise the organisation. If research involves children, it will definitely need an additional layer of scrutiny from an ethics committee. Similarly with what's sometimes called captive populations, people in hospitals, people in prison, sometimes people class students as captive populations because they're part of an institution. That's a non-trivial point, because it would be unethical to ask people to fill in a survey and make it conditional on their achieving a certain grade, let's say, if that was going to be used for research. Although that does happen, that's unethical. You need to think about the consequences of the research as well. So it's not just what you do in the immediate setting of the research or how it's shared or disseminated later, but what will happen over time. And sometimes people can feel wronged by the research process. So you need to have sensitivity. The best way to try and avoid that happening is to give a comprehensive and detailed initial briefing, and to respect the idea that it's a process, repeated negotiation, there's a repeated need to restate, re-emphasize one's integrity and credibility. And you also need to try and minimize and alleviate distress. So I mentioned the do no harm as a principle, the two main principles of research ethics being informed consent and do no harm. This is actually slightly tricky if you think you're not allowed to do any harm at all. If you're not allowed to make somebody feel uncomfortable, then actually that might be part of what the research problem needs. You might need to challenge someone's assumptions. You might need to ask them to recall an incident where things didn't go well. You might need to ask a question that you know is going to make somebody feel uncomfortable and might even make you feel you might even make you unpopular, or it could be misinterpreted with them at a later time. So the do no harm is it's not exactly like a categorical imperative, because it depends how you define harm, because there are situations where you want to ask difficult questions or get people to recall things that are challenging or problematic, or that you might need to broach some sensitive topics. Anonymity, privacy and confidentiality, you need to give some realistic guarantees about that. So it would be unrealistic to say to anybody, if you're going to quote them at length verbatim, that nobody would be able to work out who it was giving that quote, because in some settings, if they know who else you've been speaking to, people might be able to trace back a quote to somebody. Sometimes you'll get a quote, or there'll be other data that's too sensitive to record, maybe the detail someone puts in an open-ended question. What you can do with confidentiality is start with the principle that you need, when you're presenting data, to share enough information and sufficient context for another reader to be able to evaluate whether the inferences you have made are valid or not. So in other words, there needs to be enough detail for somebody to check your claims about what was said. Now, sometimes it might be necessary to give someone's age, it might be necessary to give somebody's position or job title, it might be necessary to give someone's gender, or biological sex rather. And in those instances, when you do that, you're obviously narrowing the pool of potential people that the quote or a survey response could be from. So you need to give realistic guarantees and think about that. I mean, you might even want to change unimportant minor details. Obviously, you're not going to refer to people's names, but if someone's been working somewhere 12 years and you say they've been working there 8 years or 15 years, it doesn't necessarily matter in terms of their, the information that they would have, because they've been there a long time in sort of colloquial terms. But it might be helpful to change that purely and simply for the fact that they can't be identified by other people. That level of kind of forensic detail isn't always necessarily going to be needed. Similarly, you're not necessarily going to need to give somebody's exact age. So you need to sort of think about those issues. Obviously, you need a record of those somewhere so that that you can interpret it very carefully and in a detailed way, but you need to try and preserve anonymity and confidentiality. You can use pseudonyms, you can talk about people at a certain level of analysis, you can talk about what a group said. You can also have embargoes where the work that you have produced isn't accessible for some time. In terms of obligations to sponsors, I'll go through this a little bit more quickly. You might have conditions of access or funding. You might struggle if you have agreed with an organisation what will happen in publication terms, or the kinds of things that you say to them that you'll be careful about. You might struggle if further down the review process you're pushed in a certain direction. Similarly to avoiding problems with interviewees as individuals, the best way to head off those kinds of difficulties is to have an initial briefing that's extensive, and it's a continuing negotiated process. However, it can be difficult because sometimes people at organisations change, or they revise their policies in relation to what they do with research and so on. So you shouldn't accept any contractual conditions that depend on, a good news story, if you like. You shouldn't allow organisations to dictate to you what you can publish purely and simply because they want a good story. So you need to be careful about those kinds of issues. It can help to have a memorandum of understanding or a written contract saying what level of information you'll give them, what steps you'll take about anonymity and confidentiality and so on. But you need to retain the right to publish. you've got a responsibility to do that, as well as career incentives and so on. Ownership of the data is something that you should discuss, particularly with something like GDPR. There are quite a lot of templates online that you can look at now to follow that kind of, observe good practices there. You should be honest about your qualifications, your expertise, and your limitations. You don't need to necessarily be too self-effacing. You don't put yourself down. And if you're doing, say, let's say a PhD, a lot of people will see that as quite prestigious, and there's no need to kind of embellish or exaggerate over that, but you need to be honest about limitations. You need appropriate resourcing to do any research. You need access, things like that. And there are implications if you accept funding from some sources. Sometimes funding can come with strings. Some sponsored fellowships or sponsored studentships can be from particular bodies or organisations that can be implications of accepting funding. And you need to always consider the reputation of your institution and your supervisor if you're a PhD student. Covert research, I've mentioned, what that does is it violates the principle of informed consent, which is one of the two main things. Sometimes people do this and then have what they call as post hoc informed consent, so you tell somebody afterwards. It needs approval from other professional colleagues. Post hoc, after the event, that means it can be necessary if you're investigating some phenomena. I don't just mean undercover type research, but if you're doing social psychology or psychological phenomena, if you tell people at the front what it is at the beginning of the experiment, what it is that you're trying to find, that quite often would frustrate a lot of designs. So there's areas of judgment there. So knowledge of being studied is likely to change is likely to change the behaviour being studied. It's only acceptable if other methods are impossible, and there's a kind of public interest defence. So the most common argument for allowing the absence of informed consent is that there is a greater good that is served by doing that, because the informed consent is a right that people would have. So if you think back to the Kantian and the utilitarian perspectives, informed consent is, a Kantian or duty, and the social responsibility is a utilitarian argument. So it's kind of saying we can breach these duties or rights around process if we can realise greater goods. There's an example of an undercover ethnography there within policing that used covert elements of covert research. Sometimes you could say it's the only way to access the depth of data that you need, and it might be that this is the only way to uncover the voice of the underdog, if you like, or to hear the voices that are powerless in other dimensions, because they might not have sufficient power to open up to more overt methods. Personal ethical issues: don't put yourself at risk. You can be at risk physically, and you can also be at risk emotionally. What people don't anticipate is that when they do interviews, not only is it very tiring, but you can hear things that make you feel sad and down, when you hear about other people's problems. And when you do an interview, you quite often hear it not just about the sunny side of things, but where people have problems. Research ethics is about your relationship with your study, but also don't put yourself at risk. Reflexivity, so it's kind of helped if you have a diary, but certainly if you have a plan, you need to think about two basic questions. Can you live with the consequences of any actions that you take? So, not just the next day, the next week, but for your career. And also, how would you feel if you were the research subject? So this is a great example, again, of a Kantian principle of reflexivity. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the golden rule. in face-to-face research, there's vulnerability on both sides. You're kind of directly in touch with respondents. You're often on someone else's turf. You're an outsider. That can have, ethical implications in terms of whether you're unconsciously violating things or you're unconsciously changing a situation. And, you might be ignorant of specific customs. Rod Rhodes gives a good example. He was doing an ethnography, which involved observation in one of the ministries, one of the government bodies, right at the top. And he noticed that the desks were facing a certain way, with the most senior person's desk facing the others, almost as though they were monitoring them. And so he just casually remarked on this, saying, why are the desks facing this certain direction? The next time he came in, they'd all changed their desks around. So, you can kind of intervene and change things without, being aware of it. So you need to be cognizant, you need to be mindful of those kinds of issues. In terms of personal impact, be in touch with emotions and feelings. So this quote from Johnson suggesting that, this idea of detachment and impartiality is so strong that having feelings is like a taboo. You need to acknowledge that there are emotions and feelings, and research is a human experience, and it can change not just the person that you're speaking to, but also the researcher. So there are some interviews I've done, and I can remember with incredible clearness and clarity what the conversation was. Even, a fairly short conversation I can still see in my mind, because it was a very powerful and impactful experience, and it certainly did change, my perspective of a number of things. This is a good quote about subjectivity. So I just mentioned about detachment and emotions and feelings and so on. If you are putting yourself in the center of research and you're acknowledging your role in interpreting it and possibly influencing it, but being influenced by it and so on, that isn't a failing or a lack of objectivity. It's a necessary part of interpretation. So you can be subjective. In fact, you need to be. You can't give a detailed, rich account of someone else's world without that being your interpretation. But you can be subjective at the same time as guarding against, different forms of bias. Being reflexive. Telling a story. So sometimes ethnography involves observation is often about recreating a story, and when you're giving examples or cases or vignettes or whatever, these aren't like pebbles that you pick up on a beach that you're walking along. You are actually fabricating a slice of social life that you packaging up as a story. So even in that instance, there's a kind of exercise of power, and there's a way in which you're affecting the social world by the way in which you describe it. Dark side of research, I'll go through this a little bit more quickly. So the idea of servants of power comes from a very influential book which basically suggested that psychology in particular was, because of where it got its money, like the US military in a lot of cases, was in a sense serving power. And so if you're a researcher, let's say in business and management, are you for management or are you about management, a distinction Martin Parker uses. So you could be on your guard about that. If you're giving a voice to power, or your research is being directed by whatever power wants you to look at and so on, then you need to be mindful of those things. Little Albert, this is a kind of horrible story where I believe it was the son of one of the nurses in this hospital was conditioned to fear a rat by someone banging metal behind them so that it would cause the child to cry. And what they discovered is that they could condition this baby to cry in response to fluffy animals. I think it even worked with like a Santa beard and stuff. And obviously, it's a horrific paper to read, actually. So they talk about this baby crying in very kind of analytical terms, and there's a kind of forgetting of what it means to be human, really. So they force the baby to do things, they make it upset and stuff. What's kind of complicated and uncomfortable is that you actually learned quite a lot about things like perhaps the development of phobias and even how to treat phobias from this groundbreaking study. So there might have been a utilitarian argument for something like this, but then of course one could say, well, there must have been other ways of finding this than terrorizing a baby. Stanford prison experiment, very well known, Professor Philip Zimbardo setting up a mock prison, getting people to take part. The key thing was at the beginning guards and prisoners were randomly allocated, and yet people quickly adopted these roles, and there's some shocking things that happened. So this was one of the guards. He took it on himself to wear this kind of uniform associated with, I think it was from the film Cool Hand Luke, one of the prison guards in there wears these mirrored shades. And Zimbardo himself lost perspective and became kind of he became lost in his role of kind of prison guard, seeing the police's failure to cooperate with him as a lack of cooperation between our correctional facilities. It's had a lot of criticisms levelled at it, but the learning from it has been incredibly powerful in the sense that people now understand the role of situations, the context, rather than personalities on people's behaviours. So you can have greater insight into why people assuming certain roles within organisations, managerial roles, might become more callous or potentially more instrumental, or conversely they could become more altruistic and empathetic depending on how the organisation is run. That's just an example of one of the prisoners, in inverted commas, who was put into a stress position as a form of punishment. The guards improvised and invented forms of punishment. That's an overview of ethical theories, ethics as it applies to research ethics, and the dark side of research. Hope it's useful.